Hey guys, today I'll be reading a one-shot fic, Finding Fido by ASharksReadingGlasses. Now this is a series, so please go check out the other fics, and further information will be in the description. Danny wasn't sure if what he was about to do would be appreciated, but screw that. He was a meddlesome teenager. It was practically his job. He hit send on his text as he walked down the street towards another Dunkin' Donuts he saw on his way back from the hotel from yesterday, making sure to keep with the crowds as he passed particularly dark alleyways. To Arachnophobia. Hey, how's he doing? From Arachnophobia. Could be better, but could also be worse. He's been staying in bed, but I've been keeping company. To Arachnophobia. You guys still at the safe house? From Arachnophobia. Yes. Why? Wait, Daddy, no. To Arachnophobia. I'm bringing breakfast. Does Wade like donuts or egg wraps? From Arachnophobia. Danny. To Arachnophobia. Too late. I've decided on donuts. What are his favourites? From Arachnophobia. You're really determined to do this, aren't you? To Arachnophobia. Hello, literal ghost kid. I'd like to see you try and stop me. Danny put his phone in his pocket when Spider-Man didn't respond back and hurried towards the donut shop at a better pace. It was a bit harder to walk down the streets than the last 3 days. The sidewalk overcrowded with people trying to get to their morning jobs, and skeleton crews making their way back home. Danny did his best to dodge people, making sure to clench down his instincts to make himself partially intangible when he couldn't quite sidestep some people. He still had some emergency ectoplasm left from yesterday, but he knew how to keep some for later. He slipped inside the pastry store, surprised it was still full at 9:30 in the morning. As he got in line, he shot down another text over to Spider-Man. To Arachnophobia. Dude, I'm at Dunkin'. Seriously, what are his faves? Arachnophobia is typing. Arachnophobia is typing. From Arachnophobia. Boston cream, and those icing-filled powdered ones. Don't know if you saw the unit number on your way out yesterday. It's C46. There's a buzzer. You'll have to press it so I can let you in. To Arachnophobia. Be there soon. When Danny got up front, he ordered 5 breakfast sandwiches with 2 sides of hash browns for himself, and a dozen of the specified donuts for Wade and Spider-Man. The barista not even batted an eye at the amount of food in his order. He went to the end of the counter at the food window and started tapping his feet, but was surprised when they had his order out to him in less than 3 minutes. He took his food after going back and putting a 5 in the mug, carefully walking out the street and slowly retracing his steps back to the safe house so the donuts wouldn't get crushed. Now that Danny really had a moment to look around, he noticed that the area wasn't great, which was probably why he got nabbed yesterday. There were dumpsters, trash cans overflowing with debris, piles of cigarette butts and stoops like nobody bothered to clean them, and people gathering in 3 to 4 man groups along the corners. Danny felt a slight chill down his spine and paused to drag the hood of his hoodie over his head and patted his pockets to make sure the switchblade Wade had given him was still there. The next time someone grabs you and you can't use your powers, use this. Flick it open, stab it anywhere, twist it and run. Danny gulped and hurried towards the appropriate apartment building, pushing the correct button on the intercom console, booking it to the 4th floor before pausing at the safe house door. Should he knock, turn intangible and go in? Before he could decide, the door was pulled open. The dude at the door was maybe 6 or 7 inches taller than Danny, had short messy brown hair, with bud-sized blue eyes and a crooked nose that looked like it was broken a lot. He looked around 30 years old, and he wore a plain grey t-shirt with loose dark blue sweatpants that dragged on the floor at the heels, and white socks. Both of them paused before the guy spoke. "Hey, Danny," the guy said with Spider-Man's voice, and moved aside. "Come on in." Danny walked through the door, pausing to tear off his shoes and shuffling them over by some other sneakers by the door, before settling their breakfast on the table. The kitchen looked different from yesterday. All the wrappers from Danny's impromptu binge were cleared off from the table, and the leftover candy and snacks in the pile of the corner, and the other side was covered in a few empty beer bottles and pizza boxes. There was a muffled hum and tumble of washing machine as Danny pulled out a chair and sat down while Spider-Man leaned up against the counter by the sink, rubbing the back of his head. "So, introductions, I guess," Spider-Man said, then paused to swallow nervously. "My name is Peter Parker, and I'm Spider-Man." There was an awkward pause that made the air feel tense, and then Danny opened his stupid fucking mouth. "You're a lot older than I thought you'd be," Danny blurted out, then blushed like crazy and instantly wished he had enough power to spare to turn intangible and sink into the floor. Spider-Man jolted and let out a choked bit of laughter, then crossed his arms and smiled. "Ouch," Peter said good-naturedly. "Geez, kid, you really don't pull your punches." Danny hid his face in his hands and let out a string of incompetent syllables. "I didn't mean like that," Danny whined. I just meant, well, you're an adult, right? Don't you have a job or something?" "I'll call in sick," Peter replied, and Danny frowned, unsatisfied. "You know, he isn't going to get better in a day, right?" Danny asked softly. Peter flinched. His eyes trailed to the floor. "I know," Peter whispered, "but I just can't take a week or two off on such short notice. And I have to get a doctor's note if I want to take sick leave." Danny took a moment to think as he dragged his bag of hash browns and breakfast sandwich to himself, reaching inside to take one out. "Tell your boss you're afraid your friend is going to commit suicide and you want to take a couple of weeks off to make sure they're okay," Danny suggested as he started to peel the wrapper off his sandwich. Peter jolted and dragged his eye away from the door to shoot Danny a glare. "Danny!" Peter said incredulously. "What?" Danny responded quietly, glaring right back. "It's pretty much the truth. What are they going to do? Tell you no? That would just make them douchebags." Peter blinked before rubbing out his eyes. "Even if I were to do that, I don't feel comfortable leaving you here with Wade for that long by yourself," Peter sighed. Danny bristled and ripped the paper wrapping on his sandwich loudly. "I can keep you company for a couple of hours," Danny said harshly and took a bite. Peter stood up taller and made a step towards the table. "Danny, no way," Peter protested, but Danny cut him off. "I said," Danny replied, his eyes glowing uncontrollably, making Peter freeze, "I can handle it." Peter frowned and slowly went back to leaning against the counter while Danny turned his head and tried to get his power back under control, his sandwich lying on his wrapper on the table. When Danny was sure his eyes were all set, he turned back, started picking pieces of his sandwich. "There's this ghost that haunts my school," Danny started. "His name is Sidney, and he was bullied to death in 1955. Danny paused and glanced at Peter when he shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't get along at first. We had a bit of a misunderstanding when we met, but when I was getting bullied on pretty hard, he would lead me into these hiding places around the school, and we would end up talking. Sometimes I would skip classes just to hang out with him if I was feeling like shit and didn't feel like bothering my other friends. The last time I talked to him, he told me he wished I was around when he was alive, 'cause maybe then he would have graduated." "Look, Peter," Danny said, "I get it. I'm just some weird ghost kid you met 3 days ago. You don't have a lot of reasons to trust me, and sometimes I say stupid stuff. But I've been told that ghosts make pretty good listeners, and I really just want to make sure Wade's okay." Peter sighed wearily before walking to the other side of the table and sitting in the other chair, flipping the lid off the box of donuts and grabbing a Boston cream. "If we're doing this," Peter said, brandishing the donut like a weapon, "we're setting some ground rules." "Okay," Danny instantly agreed, sitting up straight. "First," Peter started, Wade has some serious scars in his face that he's sensitive about. Don't stare at them. Second, he gets pretty bad intrusive thoughts. Wade calls them boxes, but if you see him talking to himself, try and distract him. Third, Wade keeps guns and ammo here. I moved them all to a chest that I have a key for, and I made sure all the guns were empty. They're in the closet in the other bedroom. You still okay with this? Danny followed everything until Peter mentioned guns, his hands clenching on the table and his toe curling in his socks. You guys don't have a gun safe or something? Danny asked in disbelief. I did the best with what I had, all right, Peter said as he took a bite of his donut, chocolate icing smearing his cheek. This is an emergency safe house, Danny. We only come here if one of us needs to get patched up and it's too dangerous to go home. Daddy gulped and took a bite of his sandwich to hide his nerves. Can I move it into the wall or under the floor or something? Danny asked after he chewed. Just to be safe. Peter blinked in surprise. You have enough power in your reserves for that? Peter asked. Danny grimaced. I'll have to eat an entire buffet for lunch, but yeah, I can do it, Danny answered. In that case, help yourself to any leftovers in the fridge. Peter replied, taking another bite of his pastry and putting it down on a stray napkin before standing up. He motioned for Danny to follow him, and they walked deeper into the apartment towards the second bedroom, which had a tiny bed, on top of which was Peter's Spider-Man suit, a small clothes bureau, and a closet. Peter opened the closet and picked up a finished chest before setting it down on the floor with a thud. Danny tapped his feet on the floor looking for something that sounded hollow before he found the spot, and got on his hands and knees before turning his head and neck intangible and looking under the floor. There was a little hollow space surrounded by insulation and pipes that was just big enough for the chest. Danny lifted his head up to tell Peter when he heard sniggering. What? Danny glared. You just... Peter gasped while bringing up a hand to hide his laughter. Stuck your head through the floor like an ostrich buried head in sand. Danny blushed and stood up, reaching over to pull the heavy chest into the correct position. What is it with you and Wade making animal comparisons? Danny whined as he turned the chest intangible and let it slip into the floor. Sorry, Peter apologized, but the smile on his face said otherwise. Danny huffed as he dusted off his hands and made his way back to the kitchen and sat at the table. Peter followed him back out, picking up his donut and finishing it in one bite, using a napkin to wipe his face. Okay, one last thing, I guess, Peter said as he put his chair back. Don't try pushing him to talk. Wade's got, well, you could call them triggers, I guess. Just let him lead the conversation. Got it? Got it, Danny confirmed, taking 2 quick bites to finish his sandwich and starting to unwrap a second. Peter watched in bewilderment and resigned amusement before shaking his head slightly. Okay, Peter said. I have to get changed and get out here fast if I want to make it to work. He turned back to the second bedroom and closed the door while Danny continued eating his breakfast, making it to his 4th sandwich before Peter came back into the kitchen. His grey t-shirt was now dark blue, covered by a tan jacket, and he had changed out the sweatpants for jeans. Peter paused on the way to the kitchen and stopped by the Wade's door, knocking softly. Wade, he calls out, it's Peter. I have something real quick, but Danny's here. I'll be back soon, okay? Peter sighed dejectedly when he didn't hear Wade reply, then swung by the table and ruffled Danny's hair. Danny squawked and tried to duck out the way, and Peter chuckled. Thanks for keeping an eye on him, Danny, he said sincerely. Wade might want to put his mask on when he wakes up. His suit is in the washer right now. Can you do me a favour and hang it on a door or something when it's done? No problem, Danny mumbled, trying to fix his hair as Peter walked to the door and slipped on his sneakers. He was about to continue to dig into his forced sandwich as Peter was leaving when he stopped at the door. "And Danny," Peter called out, making Danny pause. "You said I don't have a lot of reason to trust you, but you've given me plenty. Don't sell yourself short." Danny blushed in shy embarrassment and nodded bashfully. Peter beamed and shut the door. When Danny was sure Peter was gone, he got up and started tidying the kitchen, throwing away the empty beer bottles and pizza boxes. After that, he settled down to eat the rest of his food quickly, listening intently for any noise in Wade's room. After 10 minutes, Danny got up again and grabbed two donuts, one of each flavour, wrapping them in a napkin before going to Wade's door. As he was about to knock, cold mist rushed past his lips and Danny resigned himself to more ghostly hiccups. "Wade," Danny called out as he knocked. "It's Danny. I'm coming in with breakfast, so yell at me or something if you don't want me to come in." When Danny didn't hear any protest, he eased up the door and walked inside. The window that was open yesterday was obviously locked and the curtains were drawn, making the room dark enough to barely see. Wade appeared huddled on his side with his back facing the door, blankets covering his head and the shade nestled behind Wade's bent knees in a shapeless blob. Another ghostly breath left Danny's mouth and the shade shivered a bit before two tiny eyes formed and watched him. Danny tiptoed over to the bed behind Wade and kicked at one of the bedposts. After a few taps, Wade stirred. "Peter," Wade groaned and sounding like he just woke up. "For the last time, just leave me alone." "It's Danny," Danny replied. The response was instantaneous. "Jesus fucking Christ on a cracker," Wade shouted as he pushed himself up, making the shade jolt. Keeping the blanket and sheets wrapped around him, Wade swung his legs over the side of the bed, and the shade quickly drifted to hover over Wade's back before plopping down on his shoulder. Wade stilled, and they both took a moment to settle themselves. Wade moving his head like he was looking for something, while Danny hiccuped on another mouthful of mist. "What the actual fuck are you doing here, and why the hell is my mask? Your suit's still washing, and Peter had to go to work to request some days off," Danny answered. "Great," Wade said despondently. "Fan-freaking-tastic. So he left you with babysitting duty, huh?" "No," Danny answered sincerely. "I told him I want to make sure you were okay, and then he put my shoes up his arse so he would get a few days off work." Wade let out a small, quiet chuckle, but Danny could tell he still felt uncomfortable. "Hey, is there anything I can get you?" Wade flinched slightly and paused before throwing his thumb over his shoulder, pointing to a small bureau. "There's a zip-up hoodie in the bottom drawer," Wade answered. Danny swallowed nervously and then took a small step forward and put the wrapped pastry in the mattress next to Wade, pausing when Wade flinched slightly and the shade migrated to his other shoulder. "Food is on your left," Danny said as he stepped towards the bureau, feeding the shade a very tiny amount of ectoplasm so it would stop his ghost senses from going off. He dug through the bottom drawer until he found a zip hoodie he could practically swim in and placed it next to the pastries on the bed before sitting on the floor and leaning against one of the bedposts. Danny heard the blanket rustle and the zipper as Wade shifted and put the hoodie on, and he heard the crinkle of a napkin as Wade unwrapped the pastries. "You guys got me my favourites," Wade whispered. "There's a lot more in the kitchen," Danny said from the floor, deciding he would stay ducked down until Wade told him otherwise. "And I demand at least 2 as payment." Wade chuckled softly again before digging in the pastries. Danny waited quietly, bringing up his phone and going through his camera roll just for something to do. When he was sure Wade was finished, he decided to do something stupid. Peter was so going to kill him for this. They aren't that bad, Danny said. Your scars, I mean. Wade snorted. My face looks like a topographical map of Utah, he said deliriously. I doubt you've seen worse. Not true, Danny piped up from the floor, stretching the legs out in front of me. I had to fight a giant ghost made of snot before. There was a pause before Wade's stifled laughter. You fought an actual snot monster before? Wade asked. A ghost snot monster, Danny clarified smugly, putting his phone back in his pocket. My teacher tells me it's important to be specific. Wade let out a short bout of actual laughter. Danny grinned in victory. He was on the roll. Dude, it was so gross, Danny whined. Ectoplasm from spectres have the consistency of partial set jello. But ectoplasm snot? Danny faked a hurl as Wade chuckled. Dan. He heard the squeaks of the mattress springs and kept his eyes firmly forward as Wade made his way to the door, his bare feet slapping on the floor as he walked. Well, better make sure you don't die of starvation, Wade said, the shade bobbing with his movements as he walked into the kitchen and to the table. Jerk, Daddy called out cheerfully, pushing himself off the floor, and hurried towards the kitchen. Now that he could see better, Wade was wearing similar sweatpants to the ones Peter wore, and had pulled the hood up on his hoodie. It covered most of his face, leaving his mouth, nose and cheeks clearly visible, while hiding his eyes. Danny had seen some of the scarring yesterday and the day before, but he never realised how far it reached until now. He sat in the chair opposite of Wade and tried not to let his eyes stray across his face, focusing on one point. Wade placed 2 donuts on the wrapper Danny had left over from before and then settled in the other chair to dig in. By the way, Danny said, he licked the icing off the powdered donut. Peter gave me free rein over any leftovers. He paused for a moment, and as the shade slinked down Wade's chest and sat on the top of the table between his elbows. Geez, Wade grumbled after biting into a Boston cream, and Danny's eyes skipped to the previous spot. You're not even adopted yet, and you're already eating me out the house, I know. I normally don't eat this much, Danny admitted, nibbling on the donuts. But I have to keep my energy levels up somehow, and I only have a little left from my emergency stash. How does that work anyway? Wade asked, and Danny glanced at the shade stretched up and tried to inspect the rest of Wade's donut. Danny said, dragging his eyes back to Wade's head. I'm not really sure. This is the sort of the first time this has ever really happened. The town where I'm from is drenched in ambient ectoplasm, so my friends and I think I just sort of absorb it unintentionally when I'm in my human form. It's weird being this hungry. Peter might, Wade started, then seemed to realise something and froze, clenching his mouth shut. Peter might, Danny trailed off in question, taking another bite. Peter might be able to figure it out, Wade said cautiously, finishing the Boston cream and reaching for a powdered one next. I'll have to ask him when he comes back, Wade replied, and the tension in Wade's shoulders relaxed. So he told you, Wade sighed, putting down the pastry and stuffing his hands in his pocket. Danny shrugged and glanced back. Danny shrugged and glanced down to the shade again as it inched its way towards the drop of confection. I kind of blindsided him when I told him I was coming back here, and he couldn't have done anything to stop me, Danny responded, refocusing on his own pastry. I think he panicked. He would panic, Wade snorted. The dork. Danny chuckled and they settled into comfortable silence, his attention straying to the frankly hilarious antics of the shade as it explored half of the table. Hey, Wade said suddenly, and Danny jumped, not to be off topic or anything, but do I still have, That hitchhiker you mentioned yesterday? Danny flinched and ducked his head. Sorry, Danny replied nervously, letting out a shaky laugh. It's just being really distracting right now. What's it doing? Wade asked after a moment. Danny froze in surprise, then grinned in excitement. You want to see? Danny asked eagerly. Wade answered, leaning back in the chair slightly. Sure? Danny beamed and started gathering his own ectoplasm in the tips of his fingers, making them glow green, keeping the output low so they wouldn't develop into ectoblasts. The shade zeroed in onto his fingers like a laser sight, and Danny made a come here motion with his hands. The shade floated softly over to his hands and started mouthing at the tips of his fingers, licking off the energy like a puppy licking peanut butter off a spoon. Danny carefully cupped his hands to cradle the shade, petting its gelatinous body before bringing it close to his mouth. Danny had been practicing this trick ever since he read on one of his parents' papers about how temperatures affected ghosts. He didn't quite understand all the scientific laws, but he got the basis. Heat causes ghosts to destabilize and cold gave them power boost. Reaching deep into his core, Danny built up something like his ghost sense in his throat. Holding it back until the right moment, he breathed out a cold mist that frosted his hand a bit and was easily absorbed by the shade, while it also lowered its temperature. As he finished breathing out, the shade shivered in its hands before its ectoplasm body started to glow a toxic green like his eyes. Holy shit! Wade shouted as he leaped from the table. The shade jumped into the air and turned to look at Wade, seeing that it had its complete attention. It trailed slightly before swirling around Danny's head, tiny ghost tail highlighting its path. What's happening? Wade asked. It's okay, Danny placated, guiding the shade with his fingers again, and letting it weave and twirl through them. It's just happy. Not many shades get to be this solid or be seen by people. And that thing has been attached to me? Wade asked shakily. Suddenly, Danny got nervous and gently grabbed the shade out of the air like grabbing a baby bird, cupping it back in its hands and bringing it to its chest. The little shade whined as it tried to escape Danny's hand, but it was having trouble reaching for intangibility. It's not hurting you, Danny said sternly, and Wade flinched at his tone. You said it was feeding off me, Wade shot back. Yeah, on your emotions, Danny rebutted. It's not a parasite. Emotions mimic electrical signals in your brain, and that gets printed on ectoplasm. It's just been hanging around you, not sucking out your soul. Okay, Wade said placatingly, slowly sitting back on the table. Just calm down there a notch, Chico. Danny realized his eyes were glowing uncontrollably again. The shade in his hands were trembling in fear. He closed his eyes and breathed out another cooling mist. Sorry, he whispered and opened his eyes again. Opened his hands. The shade floated up gingerly and then nuzzled his face before flying around Danny's head again, every once in a while hitting his cheek on accident as it tried to go intangible. You're protective of them, Wade observed. Danny sagged into his seat and nodded despondently, chewing on his lip anxiously as the shade started to fly closer and closer to Wade. My parents hunt and research ghosts for a living, Danny sighed. But they think all ghosts are destructive and evil, even look guys like these. Never mind the fact that most ghosts just want to be left alone. Shades are the weakest ghosts because they're easy to destabilize. They just fade out of existence if they exert themselves too much. I try to protect most shades I find and bring them back to the ghost zone, where they're safe. But I don't know if I could bring this one home while trying to hide it from my parents. It'll probably be safer with you until it becomes a spectre. Wade slowly sat back in the chair, only flinching slightly when the shade got too close before he tentatively held out his hand. The shade quickly circled back and perched itself on its hand while making another happy trill, part of its body slipping between its open fingers. "It's cold," Wade observed, slowly bringing the little blob closer for inspection. "I used my ice core to give it a little boost," Danny said, scratching the back of his head. Cold temperatures can temporarily bump up ecto-energy levels. It'll go invisible again in a few hours. "You know," Wade said after a moment, "I never thought I'd say this about a blob of goo, but it's kinda cute." The shade trilled excitedly and flew off Wade's hat to perch on his shoulder, nuzzling his neck through his hood. "Okay, never mind. This is still weird." "It's trying to talk to you," Danny said fondly, and Wade stilled. Shades can't communicate like other ghosts, so they share thoughts and intentions with each other by, well, passing through each other, I guess. Sometimes shades will sort of like swarm around each other like a school or fish if they're excited. It's actually pretty cool to watch. If this one is trying to do that with you, it means it likes you. "Not really much to like," Wade whispered sarcastically. "Sure there is," Danny stated. "Pete and I like you plenty. The shade attaches itself to you. Looks like you're pretty popular." Wade sighed, gently grabbing the shade and holding it at eye level. The shade chirped before slinking down to the abandoned donut. They both watched with interest as the shade inspected the confession, swirling and gliding around the table before chomping down and starting to float up and drag it through the air towards Danny. Wade stammered. "It's not trying to eat that, is it?" "I don't think so," Danny replied as he stood up and leaned over to the table. "I've never seen a shade do that before." Danny cupped his hand on the chain and it bobbed in its flight path due to the weight of the pastry. It steadily made its way to Danny's side and placed its stolen treat in great care next to Danny's other donut on his wrapper. After depositing the pastry, it warbled and chirped before going back to Wade's side, settling on the table while stared at it in disbelief. Did a shade just really bring him food like a cat bringing a dead mouse to its owner? "That's a good segue as any, I guess," Wade said as he patted the shade before turning his attention to Danny. "How much energy did you just blow off with your little now see it trick?" Danny flushed and ducked his head in sheepish embarrassment. "Way more than I probably should have," Danny admitted. "I kinda got carried away. I don't get to do it often." Wade sighed and then grabbed another donut and leaned over the table to place it in the rest of Danny's pastries. He stood up and walked over to the fridge. The shade watched him curiously. "Seriously," Wade grumbled as he opened the fridge and pulled out leftover pizza. "House and home." To say Peter was anxious to get back to the safe house was an understatement of the year. Danny's suggestion had worked well, but organising a week off with JJ had been the more painful than pulling teeth and took way longer than he wanted it to. He had hoped to walk the streets a little before heading back to see if he could find the creeps that had mugged Danny. But JJ had eaten all this extra time Peter wanted to spend and then some. Peter rushed out of the subway station and lightly jogged towards the apartment buildings, regretting not taking his suit this morning. He could have been back hours ago if he had used his webs. It wasn't that he didn't trust Danny, or Wade for the matter. Wade was surprisingly good with kids and teenagers. It was just sometimes Wade got waspish when he was in a mood and could say some pretty harsh things to people when he wanted to be alone. Although Peter thought as the building finally came into view, Danny looked like he could hold in his own. Peter wasn't 100% quite sure what to make of Danny. The first day they bumped into each other, Danny seemed like a kid who had just met their idol, but was still unsure of himself and a little sad. Then they met on the rooftop, and Danny's nervousness was quickly replaced by a willingness to trust, a snarky confidence, and dark humour that could rival Wade's. Yesterday was the biggest eye-opener, though. The forced calm and detachment as he clinically explained how he was almost murdered spoke eons of how often Danny faced those types of situations. But what really impressed Peter was Danny's willingness to trust, giving them a natural name that they could look up besides his alter ego, and he pushed Peter to give his own name in turn. Trust was a two-way street after all. Peter used his key to open the apartment building's lobby door before heading towards the stairway and bounding up the steps. As he got closer to the unit, his spidey sense tickled lightly along the back of his neck, just like it always did around Danny, before a different, smaller prickle started along too. He paused as he opened the stairwell door at the 4th floor, then continued the way to the unit. As he searched for the correct key, he heard Wade through the door. "Get back here, you little," heard Wade exclaim, anxiously finding the right key and turning it in the lock. Peter tried to brace himself for what he was about to walk into and open the door. It didn't help whatsoever. Danny was completely dead to the world, laying asleep on the table, his head cushioned by his arm. The donut box he had brought earlier was empty and laid abandoned on the other side of the table with a leftover pizza box that housed a lonely pepperoni slice. Random cabinets and drawers were open in the kitchen, and Wade was chasing around what appeared to be a floating blob of goo. The little goo ball was holding on to what appeared to be a pen and a wayward spoon. It stilled and turned its attention to Peter when he opened the door, allowing Wade to catch it with its hands. A small section with eyes squeezed itself out of the gap between Wade's fingers and made a cooing sound. "Oh, don't take that tone with me now, mister," Wade scolded the blob and turned around, catching sight of Peter and freezing. They both paused for a moment before Wade cleared his throat. Hey Pete," Wade said nonchalantly, and the little blob whistled a greeting as well. "Wade," Peter answered as he closed the door. "I'm glad to see you're out of bed." And he was. Peter expected to come back with Wade still locked in the bedroom, so to see him up and about was great. He could still tell Wade wasn't even close to 100%. He was more subdued and kept his hood firmly over his eyes, so most of his face was covered, but considering Wade usually wore his suit exclusively when he slipped into depression episodes, Peter counted it as a win. But on other important matters, "What is that thing in your hand?" Peter asked, the prickle in his neck flaring when the blob chirped and squeezed itself out of Wade's hand, the spoon and pen dropping to the floor. It zipped over to hover in his face, and Peter tried not to flinch. He had a hunch he knew what this thing was. "So, funny story, actually," Wade stammered as he shuffled towards them. "You know that shade Danny said he was hanging about me?" "Uh-huh," Peter responded as the bob circled around him, bumping into his shoulder every now and then. "Ta-da!" Wade trailed off nervously, making unenthusiastic jazz hands while the shade, satisfied with its apparent inspection, floated back to Wade and nestled into a gap in his hood. "Right," Peter replied, taking the explanation in stride. "Would that have anything to do with the affirmated teenager passed out on the kitchen table?" "No?" Wade started and then tried again when Peter stared him down. "And by no I mean yes." "But it was completely unintentional." Peter took a deep breath through the nose before kicking his shoes off and shuffling them out the way. "All right," Peter said, willing to drop the topic for now. He stepped over to Danny and started to shake his shoulder. "Time to wake up, kid." Danny groaned before sitting up and rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Peter?" Danny asked as he yawned. "What time is it?" "A little over 11:30, Peter answered. "Oh shit," Danny yelled and jumped out of the chair, nearly ploughing Peter over. "My parents wanted to have lunch with Jazz and I'm going to be late." Danny rushed to the door, Wade sidestepping so he wouldn't get run over as Danny pushed on his shoes. "Sorry about the mess and eating all your food," Danny stammered. I'll pay you back tomorrow or something. Don't worry about it, Peter said, amused. Danny paused, sneaking Wade a quick hug that had him freezing in place before Danny stepped back and brought his hands up to make a quick motion. The shade flew over and settled between Danny's hands, making a sad-sounding whine as Danny brought the shade closer to his face. Don't be sad, Danny said. I'll be back tomorrow. Danny glanced up at Wade before bringing his attention to the little blob in his hand. Prizorgulin poor me, he whispered, and the shade chirped and pushed itself to connect lightly with Danny's forehead before returning to its previous spot. Bye, Wade. Bye, Peter. I'll text you guys tomorrow, Danny said as he opened and rushed out the door. The unit was quiet for a moment until Peter exhaled lightly. Well, Peter groaned as he started to clean up the kitchen. That was a thing that happened. Wade snorted and walked over to the table, kicking a chair out and slumping down into the seat. Kid sure is something else, Wade replied. Besides the whole ghost thing, I mean. Peter chuckled, stepping over to the counter to close the open cabinet and drawer. It was silent for a couple of minutes before Peter spoke again. How are you feeling right now? Peter asked cautiously, coming over to sit across from Wade. Like I still want to try catching a bullet with my teeth, Wade mumbled while playing with the strings of his hoodie, and Peter flinched. Mostly because I want my thoughts to shut up unless then I actually want to try and die. Peter took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Thank you for telling me, Peter said. Do you want me to stay? Wade shrugged his shoulders and the shade chirped noisily at him before Wade rolled his eyes inside. Yeah, Wade answered. I guess I wouldn't mind your company. Peter smiled and got up to root around in the fridge to see how much Danny had eaten. Hey, Pete, Wade said, and Peter turned around to look at him. Danny said something that I think you might want to know about. Peter gulped. That didn't sound ominous at all. Okay, Peter exhaled. What is it? Danny told me his parents hunt and research ghosts for a living, Wade revealed, and the shade trembled. It took a moment for the implications to sink in, and it turned Peter's blood cold. But, Peter stammered, Danny is a ghost, or at least half of one. Uh-huh, Wade agreed quietly. Peter clenched his fist after a moment before going back to the fridge. I'll figure something out, Peter said resolutely. Wade grinned from under his hood. I know you will, he replied. Hey guys, that is the end of today's podfic. I would personally like to apologise for the mispronunciation of words and the fireworks in the background. Anywho, bye guys.